When it comes to cars, as soon as you mention that it's Chinese or that it's made in China, the immediate reaction is that it's low quality, it won't last, the parts will feel cheap, and that it's an overall poorly made car. But is that still the case though? Geely, the Chinese brand, used to make bad cars, and other Chinese brands literally just copy-pasted a car and then slapped their logo on it. But now these guys are stepping up. Like with Geely, with their acquisition of Volvo, they were able to leverage Volvo's technology into their own cars. And MG, another brand that you now see everywhere on the road, they're also owned by another Chinese company called SAIC. And SAIC has foreign joint ventures in China with Audi, Volkswagen, Chevrolet, Cadillac. And surely they've leveraged all the technology, expertise, and experience while working with those Western brands. So the question is, can we trust China-made cars now? Of course, it all boils down to preference and risk tolerance, but I'm gonna discuss a couple of things here that's gonna help you make a more informed decision. I'm gonna talk about the auto manufacturing industry in China and how they went from copying these cars to now owning these foreign brands and now producing cars that people are actually starting to love. I'm also gonna go through each Chinese car brand that's here in the Philippines: Geely, MG, Chery, Maxus, Changan, just to give you an idea of when those companies were launched and what their origins are. I made a longer episode about this on my podcast. Just search for brand origins on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The links are in the description. My name is Chris. Welcome to Brand Origins. So based on 2022 data from the Chamber of Automotive Manufacturers in the Philippines, it's clear that Japanese brands continue to dominate. Based on the number of units sold, Toyota has a clear lead with a 49.38% market share. You can see how dominant Toyota is considering that Mitsubishi is number 2 at 15%. They're followed by Ford, Nissan, Suzuki, Isuzu, Honda, and Kia. And below them are the Chinese brands Geely, Foton, and Chery. Now it's clear that Filipinos' preference continue to lean towards these brands that we're familiar with, but the Chinese brands are catching up. And take note that these Chinese brands, they're young companies, okay? Now to give you some context, Ford was launched in 1901. Around that time, our president was still Emilio Aguinaldo and the Philippines was still at war with the United States. I mean, that's how early Ford was to enter the market. Mazda launched in 1920. Nissan from Japan launched in 1933. Isuzu also from Japan, 1934. Toyota and Volkswagen, 1937. Hyundai, the Korean brand, 1967. Oh, when I've tried looking for the proper pronunciation and I gave up because everyone kept calling it differently. There's Hyundai, Hyundai. I give up. I'm calling it Hyundai. And then next is Mitsubishi in 1970. Now you guys have to take note that some of these companies were around before they entered the car industry. Like Mitsubishi was around since 1917, but around that time they were still in the shipbuilding industry. The reason why their founding date is listed as 1970 is because that's when they decided to sell cars commercially. Now compare these dates to the founding dates of Chinese car brands that have entered the country. Geely only started in 1986, Chery 1997, and Maxus in 2011. So these guys are relatively young. Even though they started much later than their Japanese counterparts, how were they able to get to this point where they're now making cars that people are actually buying? Cars that are actually getting good feedback from Filipinos? How did they improve so quickly? So to know this, we're just gonna have to backtrack a little bit to 1913, okay? Because in order for you to appreciate what Chinese car brands did, we first have to learn the history of the car manufacturing industry in China. So here's a fun fact. Are you guys familiar with the Ford Model T? It was one of the first commercially mass-produced cars and it was so popular in the US. So did you know that the Ford Model T was apparently being exported to China back in 1913? But China was only importing those cars. They weren't manufacturing cars yet. Over the years, China started to make its own cars locally. It wasn't until the 1980s until the Chinese government would allow these foreign automakers to form joint ventures with state-owned Chinese companies. So why did China allow this? China wanted to do this because they wanted to develop their local car making industry. They wanted to learn how Western brands manufacture their cars. They wanted the technology, they wanted their process. How did their factories work? What were their techniques? And so they invited all these American and European brands, telling them, you're like, okay, let's work together. Our country isn't as wealthy yet, but we're growing rapidly. The market is on the rise. You can come and make your cars here, but you have to partner up with our local companies. So these European brands kind of had a FOMO moment, a fear of missing out moment, and all of them rushed to China. So years go by and the results were pretty disappointing. The government was hoping that these local automakers would have learned by now how to make great cars so that they can grow the auto manufacturing industry. But the foreign brands were still winning. Volkswagen was making a killing in China. So what went wrong? Well, it turns out that even though foreign brands were having their cars manufactured inside Chinese factories, learning the techniques, the technology, and how to properly assemble cars, it wasn't as easy as they hoped it would be. Foreign companies were very protective of how they did things. I mean, of course, they should be. So what local Chinese car brands would do is that they would reverse engineer these cars. Like, they would literally buy a car from Volkswagen or Ford or whatever, and then piece by piece, they would figure out how the bits and pieces work. This is actually how Geely started out. The founder literally bought a Mercedes E-Class, used its chassis, bought another car, used its parts, then mixed it all up, and then that's it. That was their first car. And this is what Chinese brands did back then. Actually, even today, you can still find Chinese knockoffs. Like this car from BAIC, which is a copy of the Mercedes G-Wagon. The Landwind X7, which is a Range Rover Evoque clone. The Daddy Shuttle, which is a copy of the Toyota Land Cruiser Prado. And there's a copy of the Land Cruiser LC300 called the Hengshan L4600. Even Geely was guilty of this with their Geely GE, which is a copy of the Rolls-Royce Phantom. I made a thread about this on Twitter, so go follow me there. But eventually, Geely and the group realized that copying can only get you so far. So what happened was that while they were making these cars, there would be gaps in some parts in the panels, and so water would leak in, and the cars just kept breaking down, and the materials would feel cheap, and overall it was just poorly built cars. And so now these Chinese companies were like, you know what if we just acquire these foreign brands? Let's acquire these American and European brands, learn from them, use their logos, and produce them here in China. And this is what Geely did actually. They started making their own cars, which were just really bad cars, and then they reversed engineered that Mercedes, like I said, but it still turned out to be a really bad car. But eventually they were actually able to build a car that it wasn't spectacular, but it was good enough that the Chinese market loved it. They turned a profit. Geely started gaining momentum, eventually coming to a point when they were able to acquire Volvo, and that's when the real transformation happened. Now don't worry, I'm gonna make a separate episode focusing mainly on Geely, the story of Li Shufu and how he turned Geely into this global powerhouse. It's pretty inspiring, so I'm gonna make an episode about that one. When Geely acquired Volvo, that's when they really learned how to make proper cars. What they did was they adopted the technology that Volvo was using. I'm not sure if you guys have been inside a Geely, but the interiors are remarkable. It's not really something that's gonna blow you away, but you can tell that the design language of Volvo was definitely incorporated into these cars. And Geely didn't stop there, because in 2017 they acquired Lotus, the British sports car maker. In 2018 they acquired a 9.7% stake in Daimler AG, the owners of Mercedes-Benz, for $9 billion. And in 2022, they acquired a 7.6% stake in Aston Martin. So you can tell that Geely really is serious about this strategy. And for sure, they will leverage these acquisitions into creating better cars. And what's even more impressive is that Geely is one of the largest automakers in China that is not state-owned. So in China, there are these big four car companies, appropriately called as the Big Four. And remember that aside from these companies owning their own local brands, they form foreign joint ventures with foreign brands who want to do business in China. And all of these are state-owned, meaning the government controls them. So usually state-owned enterprises are often the biggest in each category or industry. This allows the government to have control over that particular industry. In the car industry, we have the Big Four, and the biggest of the four is SAIC Motor. SAIC owns MG, Maxus, Rowi, and a couple of other brands I won't mention because they're not as popular in the Philippines as they are in China. And they're also the joint venture partners of Volkswagen. So that's under SAIC Volkswagen, which produces Volkswagen, Audi, Skoda, and there's also SAIC General Motors, which produces the Chevrolet, Cadillac, and the Buick. The second largest of the Big Four is FAW. Notable joint ventures of FAW is FAW Toyota and FAW Volkswagen. Now the difference between SAIC Volkswagen and FAW Volkswagen is that SAIC Volkswagen produces Volkswagen cars suited for the Chinese and Southeast Asian market. So Volkswagen units from the Philippines come from SAIC Volkswagen. FAW Volkswagen produces cars that are more popular in Europe. The third largest of the Big Four is DongFeng. DongFeng has joint ventures with Honda, Nissan, Peugeot, Citroën, and the smallest of the Big Four is Changan. If that word is familiar, that's because we've been seeing Changan cars here in the Philippines. Changan is one of the most popular Chinese car brands in China. And aside from that, Changan also has joint ventures with Ford and Mazda. So now you have an idea of what the auto manufacturing industry looks like in China, which I think is an important foundation for you to be able to judge whether a Chinese China-made brand is worth it or not. The next step is to learn more about the Chinese-made brands that are becoming more popular here in the Philippines, and let's start with MG. MG's history can be traced back to this guy, Cecil Kimber. He joined Morris Cars in 1921 and became their general manager. Then he placed these special bodies on these cars, made them look better, tinkered with their parts to boost their performance, and eventually they decided to create a sports car version. That's when the MG brand's popularity started to rise. But I'm gonna fast forward a bit here, okay? So basically, several mergers happen. One merger after the other happens until 1986. That's when they finally became the Rover Group. The Rover Group had a couple of British brands, some of them I've never heard of, such as Rover, Austin, Sterling, Leyland, and some familiar ones such as Land Rover, Mini, and MG. So then in 1994, BMW acquired 80% of the Rover Group and the remaining 20% was owned by Honda. But despite this, the company continued to struggle to the point that BMW decided to sell its stake. What was left was the MG Rover Group. But the MG Rover Group continued to decline. So this is when SAIC, like I mentioned earlier, the biggest of China's big four, that's when they decided to acquire it. But it was blocked due to some complications in the deal. In 2005, some of MG's assets were acquired by another Chinese company, the Nanjing Automobile Group. Despite selling their assets, the MG Rover Group still needed money. They were still on the verge of collapse. And that's when finally the deal with SAIC, it finally went through. Eventually, SAIC and Nanjing would merge, and that's how MG ended up with SAIC. SAIC then took all of MG's assets and launched MG into markets such as India, Southeast Asia, and by 2015, that's when MG would finally make it here to the Philippines. Then we have this other brand called Chery. Now, my first memory of Chery was when I first saw the Chery QQ around 2003. It felt weird because the QQ was such a small car, and around that time, small cars weren't really a thing yet. But then it turns out it was just ahead of its time, because nowadays Filipinos won't have problems with small cars anymore because of the popularity of the Toyota Wigo, Mitsubishi Mirage, Suzuki Celerio, and honestly, Chery cars, at least the new line, they're looking really good. Just check out the beautiful front grille of the Chery Tiggo. I mean, I never would have expected that from Chery. And FYI, Chery is a state-owned company. It started in 1987. For context, Geely started in 1986. The company distributing Chery in the Philippines is the United Asia Automotive Group. They're also the ones distributing the Foton brand here in the country, as well as Mutt motorcycles. And Foton is also a Chinese car maker, and it was launched a year before Chery. And if you're wondering how Chery was able to improve its line of cars, well, it has joint ventures with Jaguar Land Rover. And then we have Maxus. Now, Maxus is one of the youngest car brands. It was launched in 2011. It's a brand under SAIC, and in the Philippines, it's being distributed by the Ayala Corporation under AC Industrials. And remember that Ayala is also the ones distributing Volkswagen, Isuzu, Kia, and Honda cars here in the Philippines. Next is JAC. I'm not sure if it's pronounced as JAC or JAC. I'll stick to JAC for now. JAC is known in China for their trucks. It's a Chinese brand launched in 1964. They had a joint venture with Volkswagen, which eventually evolved into Volkswagen acquiring JAC and its mother company. Now, if there's JAC, there's also GAC. The GAC group is the 5th largest car manufacturer in China. I checked out their website and wow, their cars actually look really good. And I've never heard of this brand until today, but based on the exterior alone, they look great. Next is BAIC. BAIC is the 6th largest car manufacturer in China. So BAIC is the one I showed earlier, which had a knockoff of the Mercedes G-Wagon. Well, they have another car that looks like the Jeep Wrangler. And then we have Changan. So Changan is a Chinese brand and it is a state-owned company. It's the smallest of the big four, but it's still pretty big. And Changan has been around for a really long time. In fact, it's considered as China's oldest automobile manufacturer. Its origins can be traced back to 1862. That's such a long time ago. Back then, it was still a military supply factory. Then over the decades, the company evolved, eventually becoming the company that would produce China's first Jeep. Now, if you're wondering who they partnered up with, where they're getting their technology and expertise, well, their foreign joint venture partners are Ford and Mazda. And then we have Ssangyong. Felt weird seeing Ssangyong for the first time because it felt like their name was misspelled because of the double S. But apparently, Ssangyong literally translates to double dragon. So it's actually a pretty cool name. And I thought this was a Chinese brand, but it's actually a South Korean brand. Ssangyong was founded in 1954. They're one of the biggest car companies in South Korea. In 2022, they got acquired by the KG Group, and in the making of this episode, it was reported that Ssangyong's name is gonna be renamed to KG. So Goodbye, cool name. And last but not the least, have you guys heard of BYD? It's a Chinese electric vehicle maker, and it's one of the companies that people are betting would be able to overtake Tesla. Although recent numbers have reported that BYD has already overtaken Tesla, apparently it's not entirely accurate because BYD still sells cars that run on gas. But in terms of purely EV sales, Tesla still dominates. BYD has one of the coolest looking cars, but they kind of have a weird name though because BYD stands for Build Your Dreams, which is kind of cringe, but okay. But with BYD, you can see how far technology has progressed there in China when it comes to car making. The fact that they're a threat to Tesla. So yeah, let's see how that plays out. Okay, so knowing all of this, let's go back to the main argument. Knowing that Chinese car manufacturers have learned a lot when it comes to building these high quality cars, knowing that these Chinese companies have been partnering up with American, European, and Japanese brands, knowing that they may now have the technology, systems, expertise, can we now trust Chinese brands? Now, personally, I think that we should no longer judge a car just because it was made in China. So I don't think that we should judge by country, but I think we should judge by brand. What I mean by that is that whereas before, where automatically once you hear that it's made in China, you'll just conclude that it's not gonna last, it's gonna break down soon, it's low quality. I think they have progressed enough that we shouldn't judge them that fast anymore because they have improved. They're actually making some really nice cars now. So don't judge by country, judge by brand. Because each company will have its own way of doing things. Different companies will have different standards. Like for one company, a phone may pass its quality control systems, but for Apple, it might be unacceptable. Many phones are made in China, so why do many people still choose Apple? There still definitely is a stigma as soon as you mention that it's made in China, but now they at least deserve a second look. But they still have a long way to go. I mean, just because Geely owns Volvo and just because they've adopted the technology, the manufacturing techniques, the design language of Volvo, Geely has yet to prove itself whether it can produce cars that last. They haven't proven yet whether they're gonna be good when it comes to maintenance or whether parts are gonna be readily available. You know how when it comes to Toyota, you would often hear friends or family share that, oh, our Toyota has been with us for 10 plus years. We haven't heard those types of stories yet from Geely owners, not because Geely is bad, but because they've simply not been here long enough. And that's the thing with car companies. Building a reputation takes a lot of time because buying a car is a huge commitment. If you're paying in installments, this decision will lock you in for 5 years. So Geely can give us the most beautifully designed car that gives you the most enjoyable driving experience, fill it with the latest technology, and price it lower than every other car brand. And this can make you go wow and amaze you momentarily. But trust is built over time. Trust is built when brands deliver on their promises, and every time they do, little by little, we trust them more and more. I think that in time, if Geely continues to deliver on their promises, they have the potential to dominate. But only time will tell. So although I don't think we should hate on Chinese cars immediately, even though I think we've reached a point where we should be more open to what they have to offer, they have a long way to go. They make so many promises, but it's easy to make promises. Whether they deliver on those promises, we're gonna have to wait and see. And that's it. If you enjoyed this video and if you want more origin stories about brands in the Philippines, subscribe here on YouTube, check out my podcast on Spotify. I make shorter clips on TikTok and Instagram and make threads on Twitter, so go follow me there as well. See you guys in the next episode.